Hello, RGL3000 students. Dr. Conway here for Lesson 3 on categorizing the benefits and costs of regulation, intended and unintended, direct and indirect. Obviously, this topic is critically important for developing your RIASs because it's the cost and benefits that impact particular people or groups of people within the scope of your regulation and the scope of your RIAS study that has to be thought through and conceptualized. So what I'm going to give you today is a conceptual framework for thinking about the types of impacts that a regulation can have. Now keep in mind that in some cases you will not consider this entire scope because we won't be able to monetize it or reach estimates, but in your RIAS I want you to be able to, we'll discuss how you would have a section that talks about those impacts, direct and indirect, intended and unintended, costs and benefits that could not be monetized in your study because we don't have the time and resources to do it. But you need to understand the scope of impacts that a regulation can have, because all regulations will impose costs and will result in benefits, but how we define those helps us to determine whether the benefits will overcome or exceed the costs of a regulation. 5 concepts generally guide regulation with respect to costs and benefits. Regulatory objectives should be proportional to the problem being addressed. In other words, the harm that's being addressed or the factors of harm that's being addressed, the regulation should deal as specifically as possible with those factors and not impose unnecessary costs on the regulated community or on third parties that can be indirectly affected by the regulation. Second, regulation should achieve an increased public welfare that outweighs the costs of the regulation, which is the central point of doing a RIAS. 3, all regulations impose costs on some and transfer benefits to others. And that's why regulation, of course, is always political. It redistributes costs and benefits between parties in society. But it's the summative impact on overall public welfare that matters. All right. In cases where the reallocation of resources is extreme or unfair, governments can develop certain other policy measures to bring greater equity to the distribution or redistribution of societal resources. For example, by doing tax credits, subsidizing investment in the new technology, and other things like that that can be done. And we'll discuss that as we go further on in the course. The regulatory design and implementation should be prioritized on those entities that will return the highest net benefits for the regulatory action. All right, so when you're doing a regulation, you need to make sure you focus it in such a way that the parties that are directly responsible for the harm are those being regulated. And even in that case, the regulation is designed in such a way that the regulated party has the best chance of being able to come into compliance effectively and efficiently. And then finally, even if the benefits of a regulation are clearly more substantial than costs, regulatory objectives should be pursued in the least cost manner. In other words, just because there's a lot of benefits of a regulation, it doesn't mean we can be careless with the costs we impose. All right. And finally, when we think about regulation for the Government of Canada, we have to take the precautionary principle into account. Right, the previous concepts I just gave you are from the Government of Canada's guidance on regulation. But we also talk about the precautionary principle. It posits that there is a duty to prevent harm, even when all scientific evidence is not in, but the prospects for significant harm associated with the hazard are likely. However, implementing this concept of practice is difficult because it's in a highly political environment of redistributing resources between constituencies within a community. We would be forcing some parties to assume a cost before the benefits are fully known. But in some cases, that's absolutely essential, especially when the natures of the harm could be very severe if we don't get it right. So we err on the side of precaution. In some cases we do that, but it's a very difficult political principle to apply in practice because of its tendency to impose costs before benefits can be fully understood. We all know about Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration. We've talked about this before. Remind yourself about that by reading that on this slide. Okay. Now, we need a conceptual framework to think about the way costs and benefits of regulation can materialize. Okay. Direct costs and benefits, intended and unintended, apply to the straight line relationship between the regulator and the regulated entities. Okay, that's why we call them direct costs and benefits. Indirect costs and benefits, intended and unintended, apply to third parties which are not involved in the regulation either as regulator or regulated, but are nevertheless impacted by the regulation. And this happens in virtually all medium to large impact regulations. Because, for example, if you regulate food quality in a different way, you're going to be impacting the people producing the food, obviously. But you're also going to be impacting indirectly those people who buy the food at the grocery store. All right? So it's important to understand that. This simple tabular depiction of this can be seen here. Cost, benefits, intended down the side of the table, intended costs, intended benefits, unintended costs, unintended benefits. And then up the top we have direct costs and benefits, and then indirect costs and benefits on third-party entities. And we can use this, we can put this table inside of a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, and literally begin to write our notes down on what types of impacts we are expecting that would occur related to a regulation. All right, and we'll talk about this more as we go through. So direct intended costs, what are those? All regulations impose direct costs on the regulator to administer the regulation and the regulated community to comply with the regulation. Costs to the regulator are implementation costs, right? The scale of these costs will obviously be determined by the scope and the design of the regulation, the objective scope and design of the regulations. And we need to realize that sometimes we need to design regulations in such a way that they're actually manageable to implement for the regulator as well as the regulated party, because regulators have decisions to make about scarcity and opportunity cost, as we discussed before. Calculations of implementation costs should be linked directly to the regulation. And in my previous incarnation, when I was running my firm, we did a lot of this work in various countries around the world where we would help design not only the regulation, but its compliance, promotion, and enforcement. In other words, its implementation. And you need to budget for that. So you link, all budgetary requests link directly to the regulation. Are accounted for the scope of the specific regulation, time, space, actions, and populations that are at issue, and involve expenditures by the organizations that have specific responsibilities for implementing aspects of the regulation. Why do I say that? Well, a lot of regulations you might not have just one government department implementing it, but it might be a shared responsibility between two departments. Or in fact, it might involve 3 or 4 departments. For example, if Environment Canada is regulating hazardous compounds and in their transportation, and obviously under CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the health minister also has a responsibility there. But then because you're regulating transportation, you would be involving Transport Canada, and you would be and they would also have a role to play in the regulation and its implementation. And each of these organizations would have costs associated with it, all right, that need to be budgeted for the implementation of the regulation. Also, whenever you're dealing with any kind of a budgetary process, you're dealing with 2 different kinds of costs, fixed and variable costs. Fixed costs are those costs that you need to pay every month or every increment, whatever the increment you are using, regardless, and they don't vary very much from within 1 year. They can vary year to year, but they're fixed costs. They have to be paid. And the other is variable costs, and variable costs are important because you can be rolling along implementing a regulation, and then all of a sudden there's a major incident, a rail crash or other kinds of major problems where you need to have variable costs to move, variable budget to move people across the country to do various disaster relief or whatever the case may be. So every regulation needs to calculate, implementation of a regulation needs to calculate fixed costs and variable costs. And that can be sometimes difficult. For example, during the Harper years of the Prime Minister Harper, we saw a situation where the government was doing lots of hiring, which became a fixed cost because you have to pay salaries. But in a lot of cases, when I talk to managers, senior managers within regulatory organizations, we have this massive expansion of staff, but we don't have any variable costs to allow them to get on a plane, go out to City X to help an industry solve a problem, because we have no variable costs. We can't use our staff nearly as effectively. So balancing, having a clear calculation and understanding of the relationship between fixed and variable costs is a very important consideration, okay? Now, the regulated community, costs imposed on the regulated community will vary quite a bit. It depends on what is being regulated, the regulatory instrument that's being chosen, and the final design of that, and how ready each regulated entity is to comply. Like some entities, for example, when Canada implemented its Stockholm Convention obligations with respect to persistent organic pollutants, Canada went out to negotiate that agreement with having primarily already banned all of these persistent substances. So most of our industries were already not using them. So our compliance costs were relatively small compared to, say, a large country like India, for example, who had not yet implemented very much on persistent organic pollutants before the agreement was reached. Sure, developed countries provide financial assistance to these countries, but obviously compliance costs of Indian industry would have been relatively much higher than compliance costs of Canadian industry, even though they're complying to the same international rules. And so depending upon where an industry is will dictate a lot where, how much their compliance cost is. For example, if we're regulating oil and gas for certain types of things within Canada, the big multinational companies, the big multinational oil and gas companies will already probably have been, for some time now, have already been in compliance with a lot of this stuff. But the medium-sized manufacturers in Canada or producers in Canada may have a significant leap to come into compliance. And therefore, governments need to be sensitive to at what stage the industry is at and how ready they are to comply and how much is it going to cost to comply, depending upon the size and the strategic position of the company. And regulators need to take that into account because they may need to provide other types of support to the industry. Accelerated capital cost allowances, technological support programs, and so on and so forth. Okay? Sorry. So these are the types of factors that a regulator needs to take into account. Direct intended benefits, of a regulation. All regulations should be advanced to enhance public welfare, obviously, which can accrue in different ways, directly and indirectly. Direct beneficiaries are usually readily distinguishable from indirect beneficiaries. For example, when a government regulates for tougher mortgage lending rules, the entire financial system enjoys a benefit, That benefit being reduced risk of loss of their resources, In that case, the direct beneficiaries will be lenders, insurers, borrowers, etc., etc., There can also be direct benefits that are less obvious, like technological innovation and competitiveness. For example, research has demonstrated that, while a lot of industry groups may claim that environmental regulation makes them less competitive, the data actually shows that in many instances, when a company is environmentally regulated, it innovates, becomes more competitive, and sometimes spins off technology that becomes a new revenue stream for that company, For example, if they innovate in water purification technologies because they're running a mine up north, that technology then becomes something that they can not only use for themselves to become more competitive, but they then can market it or sell it to a third-party company that then markets it and makes a profit off of it. So it's really important to understand that when you see an argument that all regulation is automatically costly and doesn't add to competition, that's in fact not true. What is true is that depending upon the circumstances, regulation can actually result in benefits on technological innovation and advancement. And this is an argument that we make a lot on climate change, obviously. Do we want to be part of the next industrial revolution on renewables or don't we? right? And if we miss that next wave of industrial innovation, what's going to happen to our economy? Will we still be a dominant economy, a wealthy economy or not? And these are the types of questions that need to come into every regulation. Every regulation should be thinking about what impact it will have on these types of benefits. Okay? Direct unintended costs. Unintended costs are typically associated with a miscalculation of what it will take to implement and comply with regulations. For example, if a regulation was adopted to phase out a certain class of toxic, persistent, and bioaccumulative chemicals, costs might escalate significantly if chemical replacements were not later found to be cost effective. All right, this is an argument that obviously that farmers use a lot for pesticides. If we ban the Roundup type pesticides, I mean, what are we going to do to control these pests? Or what are we going to do? I mean, we don't have a cost effective alternative for that, and therefore it's going to have a negative impact on our yields and so on and so forth. This is the argument being used, and so this is why a lot of manufacturers of these chemical compounds are now racing to find the next alternative so that they can take over that major share of the market that will be evacuated once we stop using these chemicals that are now losing court cases and being attached to die off of pollinators and so on. Okay, so a lot of the times the indirect unintended costs may be because we anticipated easier adaptation to the regulation than was possible. We found this a lot also in protecting the ozone layer under the Montreal Protocol. We brought in a class of chemicals that we thought that would eliminate the ozone destroying chemicals, and found out that they also had their own problems, and so costs escalated because we had to transfer actually from two different classes of chemicals in order to protect the ozone layer. Unintended costs can happen, okay? And those have to be thought through very careful. What are the implications if we do it this way? Or if we do this, and then if we do it this way. Those are important considerations. Direct unintended benefits can, typically are accrued by the regulated entity, but they're also accrued by the government itself. When governments regulate, they learn. They build internal capacity. They gather more information. They break down asymmetrical information. There are lots of benefits from applying a regulation that's in addition to the benefits from having industry comply with the regulation directly. Plus, with industry, some studies have shown when stricter regulations are brought in, they actually become more competitive, and they become greater in terms of making technological breakthroughs and improving product and service lines. So, direct unintended benefits also need to be thought of, okay? Now, indirect costs and benefits on third-party entities. Indirect intended costs. Yes, there are indirect intended costs, okay? Virtually all regulations impose third-party indirect costs to one degree or another. These are costs that spill over from the primary direct relations of the regulator and regulated in many cases, and in many cases they can be anticipated. For example, if we start charging more for gasoline, right, we're regulating the gasoline providers, we're taxing them a lot higher at the pump. But what impact are we really having? Well, we're encouraging third parties, the users of gasoline, to use it more sparingly. We're encouraging auto manufacturers to produce more fuel-efficient cars because people don't want to spend $150 filling up their tank at the pump. They'd sooner spend $60. And so there's all kinds of different ripple effects of a regulation choice and regulation design that can impose indirect intended costs. But you're purposefully imposing those costs because you're not only affecting the direct regulated party, but those entities that get their products or services from that direct regulated party. So you're trying to almost encircle the issue in such a way that you bring about the change in the benefits that you're seeking. The same thing would apply if we started applying taxes to junk food, or we started restricting junk food in schools. So, I mean, the regulated parties are those that are the schools, right? You can't have the junk food in the schools anymore. But the indirect impacts are obviously for the junk food producers and the junk food transporters and those who rent out those dispensary machines and so on. So you're trying to have an adjustment effect on all of those, the directly regulated party and those tertiary or third parties that have close relationship with that regulated party. Another example, if a government was considering a ban on the use of all hormones and antibiotics in food production, consumers could see meat costs increase, right? Companies under contract for providing school food programs could see their costs increase. Companies responsible for transporting food could need to take additional precautions for food safety because of the less use of drugs within the feedstock and so on. So there are all kinds of these types of impacts that emerge when you're doing that. Indirect intended benefits. Well, obviously, when we have indirect intended benefits, let's say we're regulating major water polluters of a river system. Well, it's clear that the benefits are going to be directly to the river, but there are a bunch of indirect intended benefits there. For example, the ecotourism industry, the fishing industry, communities that draw from the river for a proportion of their water, etc. So there are going to be indirect intended benefits of anything of that scale. All right. Not to mention environmental protection and wildlife generally, okay? These types of benefits can get underrepresented in regulation, particularly in the case of environmental regulation, because birds and water don't have price tags on them, right? It's very difficult to monetize those types of issues. And that's why in a lot of cases, the benefits of environmental regulation are undervalued in regulatory discussions. And industry often can use that as an argument because, it becomes much more difficult to monetize and show the pure benefits or the true benefits of environmental regulation when the benefits do not currently have a market price or they're not monetized. Then we have to go through various techniques to monetize those benefits. Indirect unintended costs, and these can often occur because of miscalculations, or when a regulation is developed, time elapses before it is reviewed and circumstances change, society changes, and so on and so forth. So these indirect unintended costs are usually discovered at the regulatory review and evaluation stage, okay? And typically those are because of changing economic or social circumstances or changes in technology or service support needs within an industry and so on. It can get quite complicated as to how these unintended costs can emerge, okay? Indirect unintended benefits. And any regulator will be very, very happy with any indirect unintended benefits. For example, if you have all of a sudden started regulating a land area like the Great Bear Forest and endangered species and so on and so forth, and you were doing that to protect the wildlife, but all of a sudden a large ecotourism industry spun up around that whole issue. It wasn't anticipated. We never anticipated there would now be 20 different lodges that have been built, and we're getting several thousand tourists that want to go in and sightsee in the region. We never anticipated that much unintended benefit. When that kind of thing happens, it's obviously regulators are quite pleased with that. And and there's other examples. For example, a ban on antibiotics in meat production. There could be a surprising slowing of antibiotic-resistant germ mutations during the winter season. For example, well, we expected some of that, but whoa, we didn't expect this much, and so on. And these things happen with regulation, right? In just the same way, it can be surprising sometimes when an industry gets regulated and all of a sudden they become a leading industry on new technologies. for water protection or air protection or whatever the case may be, or they've discovered a new technology for cleaning contaminated soil, and all of a sudden they sell those intellectual patents to another company, or they market that product themselves, etc. And that can become quite a surprise. Now we've already discussed, and we'll discuss more as we go, obviously, the requirement for the regulatory impact assessments. I call it study here because that's what we're doing, but the correct term for the federal government is regulatory impact assessment statement, okay? And it looks at the effectiveness of a regulation from its cost-benefit balance perspective, okay? And its regulatory design perspective. And we go into this in greater detail as we go through the course. You already know about the RIAS Rater's Guide. You should also be pulling down the Cost-Benefit Analysis Guide for regulatory proposals of the federal government, because any regulation you choose for your topics will be assumed to be a medium to high impact regulation, and I want you to learn the mechanics of going through a cost benefit analysis. Am I expecting a super sophisticated cost benefit analysis? That's unlikely in the time and resources that we have in the current skill profile of students, but I need you to understand how a cost-benefit analysis works, because if you're ever faced with one, either within government or within the private sector, you at least know what you're looking at, you know what to look for, you know how to interpret the results of a cost-benefit analysis. Now, cost-benefit analysis is, economists, they make it their business to make these things seem incredibly complex, but the cost-benefit analysis methodology itself is quite straightforward. What is difficult about the cost-benefit analysis is gathering the data, and it's particularly generating the data when you do not have a monetary or market price on the data points you want to collect, like the value of fresh water, the value of endangered species, the value of this tree, etc., etc. All right? But cost-benefit analysis is generally just an accepted methodological rules about how to identify, analyze, and present economic information to decision makers as one basis to make a choice. Okay, so and we'll learn about that as we go through. We're trying to determine how significant the issue is from a cost-benefit perspective. What are its economic impacts? What benefits of harm reduction are we getting? Do those benefits exceed costs? And so on and so forth, all right? And can we design a regulation in a slightly different way to enhance benefits and lower costs, or lower costs and hold benefits, and so on and so forth, all right? And I mean, it's very important that we understand these concepts, even though when you graduate from this program, you will not be cost-benefit analysis experts, but you need to understand the process. You need to understand the terms. You need to understand how it works, okay? We're also going to be looking at assessing costs and benefits from the point of strategic environmental assessment, which is a different criteria. Remember, in the first lesson, I talked to you about how in Europe we're integrating a lot of the impact analysis. They are implementing a lot of the regulatory impact analysis, to combine what we call our RIAS and our SEA into one thing. But Canada, we still tend to keep them relatively separate. RIASs tend to have a strong economic focus in Canada, whereas we have something called a Strategic Environmental Assessment Cabinet Directive that requires us to look at the environmental impacts of any major change in policy or regulation. So as we go through the course, we'll also revisit this whole issue, okay? So read these slides and understand what's going on. We also have something called Gender-Based Analysis Plus, which is more than just gender, despite its name. But it looks at other socio-cultural differences, and that has to be applied as well to regulations. So while we're doing a RIAS, we can't forget the SCA and the GBA Plus, which also become factors in the regulatory environment when we're dealing with the federal government. All right? So on that score, I'll leave it. Go through the slides carefully. Make sure you understand how to think about costs and benefits, intended and unintended, direct and indirect, and that you can conceptualize. Now, keep in mind, however, that when you scope out your RIAS, you're scoping out your RIAS to capture those groups that will experience meaningful costs and benefits, significant costs and benefits. We're not trying to measure every nth degree of everybody that can be impacted, because that conceivably, if you're developing a regulation to protect endangered species in Canada, that could be everybody. Our REASs are not scoped beyond reasonable doability or practical decision making. They're scoped in such a way that we're including constituencies within the scope of our study that have meaningful, significant, meaningful direct and indirect costs and benefits. Okay, so intended and unintended. So keep that in mind. But that matrix that I give you gives you a chance to think through when you identify your regulation for your REAS. Put that table into a spreadsheet and just start putting in the cells who would be impacted here and what are the general impacts that we would have. And then you can look at whether you can begin to think about getting financial estimates for those impacts. And in our REASs, we're going to be using estimates. I recognize that precision in data is going to be difficult given the limited resources and time we have. But I want you to come up with it. We'll be trying to come up with at least reasonable estimates, or at least we're going to be clear about how we reach those estimates, whether they're reasonable or not. Okay. And we're going to go through the exercise. So first, identify your regulation. Start to conceptualize those constituencies that will be impacted, cost, benefits, intended, unintended, direct, indirect, and so on. And then we can begin to think about how we set up our cost-benefit analysis. Okay? On that score, I'll wrap it up for this lesson, and we'll be talking to you again soon. Bye-bye now.